good evening, friends, depending upon which part of the world you are joining us from. This is Dr. Vijay Agarwal. I'm the president of CAHO. Welcome you all on behalf of the whole governing committee and patrons of CAHO to this very important 30th webinar of CAHO and ISQua of this international webinar series, which has become like a milestone, which has become like a hallmark for us to spread the message of quality and patient safety across the country and even beyond. And today, we have a very important topic of clinical governance being addressed by Ms. Margaret Banks from Australia. And to introduce her would be, of course, our moderator. And it is my really proud privilege to introduce the charismatic Dr. Guru Reddy, whom I had the privilege of meeting just about a year back. And I can tell you that I am so much impressed by his demeanor and his excellence that I cannot describe. Dr. Guru Reddy is the founder, chairman, and managing director of the Continental Hospitals. Dr. Reddy is a gold medalist graduate from the Osmania Medical College and completed his post-graduation in internal medicine, and then did his he completed his graduation from the Osmania Medical College, and then he did his post-graduation and super specialization in gastroenterology, liver diseases, and transplantation and nutrition from the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, USA. Dr. Reddy is recognized as an excellent clinician and a superb endoscopist. He has, with 4 decades of clinical experience, he returned back to India in 2013 to set up the Continental Hospitals. He is the first Asian to serve as the president of Harris County Medical Society, the largest medical society in the United States. He has been named the Legend of the Year in Gastroenterology and GI Surgery at the Times Healthcare Achiever Award and Healthcare Entrepreneur of the Year at the 6 Sigma Healthcare Excellence Awards. So with these words, I'll hand over to Dr. Guru Reddy to take the proceedings forward.
Dr. Vijay, thank you for your very kind introduction to this great audience who has joined us today. I appreciate and applaud your leadership and the rest of the team that you folks have been working tirelessly, and having an organization in India which has reached now beyond the shores of India is absolutely exemplary. Something like this would not have been possible without the sacrifice of all of you who have been contributing to this. In this very short time, I realized the impactfulness of CAHO and what future it holds for an emerging country like India in healthcare to rise up to international standards. So I have this great opportunity to have a speaker for this session. I would like to go ahead and introduce her, but prior to that, let me just briefly speak about, clinical governance at the end of the day, what it exactly means and why we all assembled here to understand this briefly. From my perspective, after serving for more than 25 years in healthcare leadership in the US, which was phenomenally helpful for me, both the capacity of chief of staff of hospitals and of the medical society and of the Texas Medical Association, all of these things for more than 2 or 3 decades. It gave me a tremendous insight and understand and practice in my career. And I was able to translate that to the Indian perspective when I embarked upon establishing Continental Hospitals here in Hyderabad. So in a nutshell, when we refer to clinical governance, in essence, it means at the end of the day that the leaders who are responsible for the governance at an institution are primarily focused on few aspects or few fundamental aspects, which are the quality and the outcomes of the patient, the safety of the patients, and making sure that the journey of the patient to any given institution is deemed to be, is deemed to be as it's supposed to be laid out by various standards. Now, the constitutional body for this clinical governance is very well defined, by various societies and organizations. I will not go very deep into that, but the responsibility of leaders who have assigned the task of clinical governance should always understand that they are responsible for the goals, they are responsible for the policies, they are responsible for all the standards, to be articulated very well to the rest of the constituents of the clinical governance, and making sure that they're implemented at all times for a successful outcome. So in essence, it is the ability to understand the principles of governance, ability to understand the empowerment given to the respective constituents to fulfill those obligations, and making sure that institution complies with all the standards of care. So this has been well defined in the Joint Commission JCI, which comes under the chapter of governance, leadership, and direction, which is on the GLD chapter. This has been well defined in our NABH standards at the end of the day. So different countries, Western countries, by the virtue of practicing this for a very long time, this has certainly become an art or an institution, basically, where people are, trained periodically, and we have very qualified people who participate. In the Indian perspective, this is emerging, and institutions like CAHO, which have come forward by organizing these kind of talks and bringing forth people of expertise, will help the current generation of leaders in India and the future generations, of leaders in India to emulate the fundamental principles of clinical governance, to take their institutions forward and see that, that quality of care and the outcomes and the safety of our patients, is the highest priority at all times. So with this brief introduction, let me just bring you all the speaker of this evening, who has kindly consented to be a part of this program. This is Margaret Banks, who holds the position of the Director of National Standards Program with the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare. Since July 2006, Margaret has been working with the Australian government, states and territories, clinicians, consumers, and other stakeholders to develop and implement 2 editions of the National Safety and Quality Health Service Standards and a program of systematic accreditation reform across the Australian health system. A very gigantic task, and we're very proud of her. In addition, she oversees the standards development and accreditation schemes for pathology, for diagnostic imaging, for digital mental health, primary and community care, as well as the coordination of accreditation for general practice nationally. So we are very happy that a person of her caliber, who has taken the mantle today to discuss and elaborate her thoughts on clinical governance and educate us. Margaret, to you.
Thank you so much, and it's good to be here and to see so many of you, and thank you for that kind introduction. So today I was hoping to just give you a very quick overview of the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare, so you understand the context in which I work, why clinical governance, established frameworks, and then give you an idea about what happens in practice. The Australian Commission on Safety and Quality, initially established in 2006, but created and our functions clarified in 2011 under Commonwealth legislation. We lead and coordinate nationally on improvements in safety and quality in healthcare, and that goes across a range of different areas. We're funded jointly by states and territories, which means that we are largely an apolitical organisation, which keeps us mostly out of trouble, but also gives us an opportunity to work with all governments in Australia. Our roles and functions include the formulation of standards related to healthcare safety and quality matters, the promotion, support and encouragement of implementation arrangements, programs and initiatives relating to healthcare and quality matters, the formulation of accreditation schemes, and the collection and analysis of data, which is incredibly important because all of this then informs the work that we do. I'm responsible for, as you highlighted, a series of standards, most recently standards for cosmetic surgery in Australia about to be released, but the National Safety and Quality Standards for the acute care sector, digital mental health, which we're translating now into virtual care standards for the growing virtual care sector, primary and community health care, diagnostic imaging, pathology. And we run schemes for general practice. We run them for diagnostic imaging, pathology, and a scheme that really covers all of the other sectors that the Commission's involved in, including clinical trials. So today I've been given the opportunity to talk to you about clinical governance, and it is an area of governance that really has a really recent history. It's a new concept, came out of the 1980s, 1990s government response to a series of high-profile incidents. The Dr. Harold Shipman, general practitioner, who has been convicted of what is believed to be as many as 215 patients' deaths. The Bristol Royal Infirmary found to have a mortality rate approximately double the national average between 1984 and 95, comprising care of children requiring complex cardiac surgery. The inquiry found that 35 children probably would have lived if treated elsewhere in the country. There was also the Maidenstone and Turnbridge Wells National Health Service Trust inquiry in 2007. In a 2-year period, it found that 90 patients died from clostridial infections, C. diff infections spread through poor hygiene practices and devastating practices. There was investigation found that in many instances, it wasn't the commitment of the health professionals or clinical expertise, but a bigger leadership health systems issues such as poor communication at play that impacted patient outcomes. A government response was a focus on protecting the public. To those atrocities led to concepts of clinical governance and steps to embed clinical governance in health services. These failings occurred in the UK, but really also occurred certainly across Australian health services, but it showed that failures can occur even in any setting. So we reflected on our own health service, and I'm sure in other services you can find examples of this. If we look at the early drivers of clinical governance, they were political in that there was change in policy, looking at and refocusing health policy from the provision of services and efficiency of services to the safety of services, the effectiveness services, but also shifting that to engaging consumers in services, and the impact of organisational change on the provision and delivery of healthcare. There was also a public expectation statement that says that patients had a greater expectation of not only being involved and having greater access to information and transparency of services, but also to be involved in their own care. Reduced public confidence, which was the outcome of these very public failings in governance, or the lack of a clinical governance structure, in that people lost trust in a service, and that loss of trust meant that it was much more difficult to retain quality staff, for patients to attend, and to believe that the organisation could in fact provide the care that they needed. There was greater demand on services, and to manage the growing demand on services, then providing high quality care or safe care meant that there weren't redos, readmissions, so services were better able to manage the throughput, and greater access to healthcare information. So patients, through things like the internet becoming available at that time, started to have a greater understanding of the care that they should or could be accessing. There was also a professional driver. with an increase in patient dependency, advances in technology, rise in the number of complaints, that drove professionals to start to look at how they could, in fact, provide care that was better quality. So what happens when there is a failure of a clinical governance? We have patients that are harmed or die. Their families are clearly affected by that. And as a group of consumers, they lose trust in the services that are being provided. There's a concept, though, of secondary victims that includes the clinicians who don't go to work to harm their patients, and therefore there's a loss of confidence or certainly concern about the care that they're providing. Managers, and certainly in Australia, the managers in services where there's very significant public failures often lose their jobs. Organisations face reputational damage, and there's a collective loss of trust in the organisation. And good clinical governance is essential to an organisation actually operating. So there are no winners in a situation where an organisation has inadequate or poor clinical governance. The Australian Commission is frequently invited to conduct reviews of safety and quality failures in Australia. And over the 17 years we've been operating, we've been able to identify a series of factors that are consistently found in situations where there are failures in safety and quality. And wherever we find a failure in safety and quality, we generally find a failure in clinical governance. And the 7 factors that we find are common across failures are inadequate or no monitoring of indicators by boards. And boards are a critical element in clinical governance. Financial performance is considered over the safety and quality performance, and we strongly believe that if you are providing safe and good quality care, that makes good business sense. A lack of transparency and inadequate public reporting of failures, because that leads to a lack of learning from the failures that occur. And if you don't learn from your mistakes, you're bound to repeat them. A failure of clinical leadership to apply clinical governance and standards. There's a raising concerns and learning from mistakes is not part of the culture of an organisation. So not only are the systems not set up to be able to learn from the mistakes, but the participants in the organisation aren't sharing the information so that they learn from mistakes. Safety and quality is not part of the culture, so an organisation doesn't value the safety and quality. And there's a failure to place the consumer at the centre of care. By ensuring that the patient is at the centre, then all of the processes around it can ensure that the patient's outcome is the one that you expect and hope for. Clinical governance then provides these benefits: community confidence in the health service delivering safe, high-quality care, demonstrates a commitment by the health service to continuous quality improvement. It reinforces to everyone in a service the safety and quality is their responsibility. So not simply the responsibility of the governing body, but the responsibility of all those in an organisation. So clinical governance, what really is it? It's a component of corporate governance, and there are multiple parts of governance, multiple facets of governance, and this is only one element. Clinical governance is the relationship and the responsibilities inside and outside of an organisation, and I'll talk to you that in a moment. And it ensures everybody is accountable to service users, their support people, and the community for assuring the delivery of safe, effective, and high-quality care. So that's what the definition that the Australian Commission has taken on has said. Now, As we were developing the second set of the National Safety and Quality Health Service Standards, started to think that governance was becoming increasingly important. And so we brought together a group of very eminent clinicians across the country, 36 of them we put in a room, and we had maybe 38 different opinions of what a clinical governance system should be. And then that lack of understanding or a collective understanding of what a clinical governance system meant that in practice, it was very difficult to put in place because there really wasn't an agreed statement about what clinical governance system was. So the Commission has developed a document which we call the National Model Clinical Governance Framework. From that, we were able to describe what we believe in Australia is the clinical governance framework. And we've modelled it around the standards by saying that if you put in place the first 2 national safety and quality standards, then they will provide you with a robust clinical governance framework for your organisation. So rather than having 2 separate documents, one that says there is a framework and the other that says here's the standards, by building and integrating the 2, we're saying that if you're putting one in place, then you have the other. And so when we talk about governance, responsibility, clinical governance being a component of corporate governance, it is among financial governance, the IT governance, the risk governance, and the technological governance. All of those elements make up your corporate governance. The other thing about them is that they're integrated. You can't make decisions in your financial governance compartment of your organisation without them having an effect on your clinical governance. The way that you make business decisions, if you are not taking into account the safety and quality or impact of those business decisions, then you're not going to support your clinical governance system. So, for example, the purchase of new equipment. If the equipment is different to the brand or the type or the age of the equipment you're using in other parts of your organisation, suddenly you may have to have 2 different sets of consumables, which gives you you're at risk of the attachments, the consumables not working together. You've got to train your workforce on a second set of equipment, which means then that there's a risk of what if there's variation in the workforce getting it wrong. So decisions that are made in your financial, in your HR, who you employ, the skills mix and the qualifications of those people, how you manage their performance affects the way that you operate your clinical governance. Because if you don't have the right skills for the right roles, then there's a greater risk of harm. If you don't have in place a mechanism for managing risk, for identifying risk and which patients and what situations create increased risk, then you have a much smaller chance of being able to mitigate those risks. And it really doesn't matter how big or small the organisation is. The roles and responsibilities go across patients and consumers, health providers, and the workforce, managers and the owners or governing bodies. So if you have a very small service, a sole trader, then they may wear all of those provider, manager, owner hats and have at different times different responsibilities under the governance, clinical governance framework. But the larger organisations, you start to split up those responsibilities and have them allocated to different people. So by recognising what role you're playing at what time and understanding what your obligation is under those roles, then you can play your part in an effective clinical governance structure. So the definition that we use is that clinical governance is the set of relationships and responsibilities established by a health service organisation between its Department of Health for the public sector or its governing body, executive, clinicians, patients, consumers, and other stakeholders to ensure good clinical outcomes. It ensures that the community and the health service organisation can be confident that there are systems in place to deliver safe and high quality care. And it is the systems and processes in place that form the protection for service providers. Clinical governance is an integral component of each of the other components, and it's everybody's business. So when we describe this in the National Safety and Quality Health Service Standards, we talk about it in terms of 5 different components. The first is, and the literature clearly states to us, that safety and quality is, you get a much better outcome when you have effective leadership. And so leadership is key to effective safety and quality. The second component is in relation to processes, then people, the environment, and patients. So collectively, each of these are important, and you need to pay just as much attention to one as the other. So in these 5 components, when we talk about leadership, we talk about setting priorities, and a governing body has a key role in this. They identify, or boards you may call them, they identify priorities. They're there to ensure and monitor and endorse the things that happen. They provide they set the culture for the organisation, and they make sure that the performance of the organisation meets the targets that are set. In terms of the patient safety improvement systems, we're talking about those things that you would expect to have in place, but they start with policies and procedures. We talk about quality improvement processes, monitoring processes. So the idea that you have in place effective measures of safety and quality. Then there are incident monitoring systems and collection of complaints and feedback, because what you're looking at is where the system has not worked and how you learn from that. There's open disclosure systems so that you can use that information and share it with patients. So they're the processes that we would see, and a risk management system to be able to identify and prioritise risk, because within any healthcare system, there are many more risks and much more demand than can be met. And so the idea is that the risk allows you to understand the priorities, and the measurement will give you the idea, the quantum of the problem that you can measure, monitor, and identify how you're going to improve it, and then measure if you've been effective at making change. In terms of clinical performance, that's about your people. Have you got the right people with the right skills and qualifications in place? Have you got a performance management process in place and a training system that ensures that they have and maintain the skills and qualifications required for the roles that they're fulfilling? Do they understand their roles and responsibilities in safety and quality? And is there appropriate supervision where that's required? There's also in this set of standards that the Commission's written, an area that talks about evidence-based practice and ensuring that there is processes in place to ensure that the workforce are using evidence-based protocols and pathways, but also to measure the variance. So an organisation provides back to its clinicians information about their own clinical practice, so that they can see where they've deviated from protocols and if that's appropriate or not, because it may well be because that was the particular need of the patient. But what is the unwarranted variation in their practice? How do they perform in relation to their peers, and where their practice might warrant improvement? The safe environment is really about making sure that no matter where care is provided, it is clean. It's it's about infection. It's about maintenance and of equipment and sterilisation. It's also about access. So are patients able to access the service, either because it's physically accessible, or because there's information about the services that are provided so they can access care. Finally, partnering with consumers. This is really at the centre, and there's two components of it. One is about consumers partnering in their own care, so being given the information in a way that they understand so that they can make informed decisions and participate in the process. The other is that they're involved in the design, evaluation, and governance of the service itself, because they are uniquely placed to have a view about how the service operates, which no other clinicians, managers, governing bodies simply don't have, but they can add something to the processes. So those two components, if you had fully implemented the first two standards of the National Safety and Quality Health Service Standards, would in fact create for you and provide you with an effective clinical governance framework for organisations. A robust clinical governance framework therefore can achieve by putting in place these two standards. But the important thing for the Commission is that in writing a set of standards, we try and say what is required rather than how it's required. Because by stating what is required, what we're saying is this is the outcome that we want you to achieve. How you put it in place will very much depend on the service that you provide, the context in which that service operates, the patient population, the complexity of your service, and all of the elements that come together and the strategies related to the risks that your patient population have. So the how is very much flexible to meet the different size and scope of services, because the standards, when they're being applied, are applied at tertiary level complex services, right down to very small multi-purpose services in Australia that operate in very isolated, remote rural settings, where in fact the services they provide might have 2 acute beds, community services, some aged care, and outreach services. So, we want the standards to apply because we want the standards to be able to say that no matter where a patient accesses care, there should be an expected level of safety and quality that's repeated wherever they are. The Commission has been through a huge implementation process, which I think is probably ongoing. And so we've developed a significant range of resources. We've provided information for governing bodies, describing in detail and then in fact sheets very simply their roles and responsibilities in terms of clinical governance. We've developed the same sort of resources for health service organisations. We've developed a user guide for governing bodies so that they can understand not just their role, but the information and data that they may need to be able to collect to measure performance. We've put out a series of risk tools and templates, and we've developed information for consumers and health service organisations. So we've had this enormous amount of information that's available and resource. We also provide an advice centre, so organisations at any time during a working day can ring up and talk to us about clinical governance or any of the other standards and issues. If we can't address them, we identify experts that can. So we've got a mechanism for people who are struggling to or have issues to come to the Commission and ask us about how things go in place. In their circumstances, what would we suggest? Are there other peer organisations that may be able to support them putting this in place? We also do observation visits and go out to organisations. We have expert technical groups that do go into services and provide support when we think there's probably underperformance. But I don't think any of this is easy. So we have what we believe is an effective and robust governance framework. We have the standards that describe practically what needs to be put in place. We have an extensive array of resources available on the Commission's website, and they are freely available, and you would be very welcome to have a look at them if they provide any useful information for you. But when I show you what we have, this is a current set of data from Australian Health Services, all of them being assessed since 2019 with the aggregated data. And that shows assessment against each of the 8 standards in the national set. The first 2 forming the clinical governance framework, the others are all clinically based standards that are implemented based on the framework or the foundation that the clinical governance framework sets. And you can see across Australia that 35% of organisations can say that they have fully implemented the clinical governance framework. That means that we have 65% of organisations across Australia that have areas for improvement to be able to implement the national standards. So with all of the resource, with all of the structures that the Commission and all of the support that the Commission puts in place, it is still a really difficult thing to ensure that clinical governance systems are working effectively on a regular basis. And while these organisations largely get accredited, so can demonstrate that they meet the standards by the time the remediation period is up, it still points to an issue in terms of the ongoing and consistent compliance and effectiveness of a clinical governance system being in an organisation. So I'm sorry, I might be a bit short in time, but the Commission's website, safetyandquality.gov.au, the tools and resources are freely available. And the Commission often has additional resources. We have a YouTube where there's training programs for infection control, and new information is available and notified through our Twitter account. And also through LinkedIn, we advertise all of our new material that becomes available. There's one other regular service the Commission provides, and I know that it's used internationally. We provide what we call On the Radar, which is a weekly, Monday morning, we send out an email of the publications that have been released in the last week. On safety and quality. There's a short summary and some links to those documents. So if anybody is interested in accessing On the Radar, you can sign up on our website, or you could email the Commission and we can add you to that email list. It is a good way of getting summary information from what is a huge body of work that is published regularly around safety and quality. So thank you for your attention. That is the presentation. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Margaret, for an excellent overview of clinical governance and what is happening in Australia. And so well your systems are established. And this information that you shared this evening, was very crisp and clear. And I'm sure there will be, there are many take-home points for the audience who is participating here. I think for me, just to make a comment at the end of the day, I've always remembered this acronym throughout my journey of participating in clinical governance and leadership. If people are interested in the audience, just memorize this acronym CLASS. It has to be a class act. So let's see what CLASS stands for clinical governance, for strategic risk. C stands for culture, L is for leadership, and A for alignment, and S for systems, and the last S for structure. So it's basically, it should be a class act. If all of us memorize this class, I am sure that we will be focusing and understanding the principles of clinical governance and the pillars of clinical governance. If you go out and Google, there are many pillars that are articulated there. Some say 10 pillars, some say 7 pillars, 5 pillars, 3 pillars. But all the pillars, I think basically, they come under this umbrella of understanding culture, understanding leadership, understanding the structure, and understanding the systems that you have at your respective institutions, how you integrate and align them at the end of the day for a successful outcome in taking care of patients. Now, with that, I've just start off with one question to Margaret. Now, this is all fine, fantastic. We try our best. We certify institutions. Those who fail, we basically, give them an opportunity to rectify, and remediate and go from there. But in a country like India, which is just emerging and hopefully will be there, sooner than later, I presume. But it's a very uphill task because of the diversity of healthcare, and based on the population basis, the size of our demographics and all of those things that happen at the end of the day. But I think the beginning is on a serious front. And once again, thanks to the leadership of CAHO and what they're doing. So my question to you is, what are the barriers that you come across for clinical effectiveness, to implement as a part of clinical governance? What are the barriers in your country, in Australia, that you find? And if you know anything about India, what you feel the barriers are from your perspective?
They are really exactly the same, I'm sure. Giving clinicians the information that they need about their own practice, engaging consumers because they are the key to understanding their own care. We have in Australia workforce issues that just managing the workforce. We have huge gaps in our workforce, particularly in rural and remote areas, that are difficult for us to fill. I know that in pathology, we've had to have special requirements put in place for supervision to manage gaps. So in one rural LHD, so a local health district, they have across a workforce 345 vacancies for nursing. Now, in a service, that's very difficult to manage a service. So actually getting down to provide safe care needs to have people with the right skills, the right people, the right skills. But you need to have people to start with to do that. The risk managing the service, so actually understanding the organisation's risks. What we often find is that that's not well done. And in fact, the data shows that that's probably one of the most common not met actions across the standards. If you don't understand the risks in your organisation, you can't prioritise. If you don't effectively prioritise, then you're not going to manage the safety and quality issues, and you're not going to know whether you've reducing your risks. So actually people with the skills and qualifications and experience to be able to identify and manage and mitigate risk are very difficult. So I don't think it's ever going to be one single factor. And I'm sure those factors are things that you would see in maybe without the workforce gaps quite so, maybe clinically trained workforce gaps, but ours are substantial in rural and remote areas.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. In the interest of time, let me open this to the rest of the audience. I think there are some already aligned to ask questions to Margaret. Please, kindly go ahead, please.
Yes,
Go ahead.
yeah. This is from Dr. Ravindran Jagasoti. He's asking, would strong clinical leadership be an essential component of sound clinical governance that withstands external pressure in a health facility?
Well, strong clinical leadership is absolutely essential, but leadership goes throughout the organisation. You talk about leadership at governance level, at manager level, and clinical leaders. All are needed in an organisation because all of them have different roles and responsibilities. But yes, it's absolutely essential. Whether it withstands external pressures, I think that would depend on what those external pressures are and who's there supporting an organisation to allow them to manage and fulfil their roles.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. This is an interesting question. This is, hi, Margaret. I would like to know on the setting of clinical governance in terms of nursing. Does it do separately? Is it aligned to the overall clinical governance or is it separate nursing governance? That's what I think the question is.
No, absolutely integrated. Your organisation should be operating as a single whole. The role that nurses play is integral, but the role that a medical workforce play, but they need to be working together. And part of the provision of a comprehensive care is understanding within a multidisciplinary team or an interprofessional team what each's roles and responsibility is, how they operate together, and how they effectively provide the care to be able to manage the needs of an individual patient.
Thank you for that. I think Dr. Shweta Prabhakar has a question. Shweta?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Elu. And Margaret, this is a wonderful session and a wonderful overview which we got on clinical governance. Really appreciate and thank you very much. On behalf of Fortis Hospital Mohali, we were, previous to your session, we were discussing on clinical governance and we were having a chat, and there was, two questions which I have from you, because, from the Indian perspective, we have been, we are a JSA organization, JSA accredited organization. And the challenge which we face is the clinician engagement, because when we talk about clinical governance, how do we get the clinicians engaged and take that responsibility or the ownership of being adopting clinical governance and taking it forward? So what's your take on that, and some kind of takeaways and like things which we can implement? And then I will ask you the second part, which is more interesting, so maybe you can answer this and then I'll move forward with the next question.
Look, I think you're absolutely right. It is very difficult. The way to engage clinicians is to make it about them and their patient. So providing them with the information about their own clinical practice and variation in their own clinical practice. So in Australia, the way that clinicians are often very motivated and want to do well against their peers. So clinical information about their own practice is one of the ways that we use, but there's always sticks and carrots. So, for example, there's we develop national indicators. So we're measuring the same piece of information. I think about the clinical care standards we put together for colonoscopies in Australia, a very big program funded by the Commonwealth. And so a large number of people in that workspace. But we wanted to make sure that the information that we were getting was appropriate. So we wrote a clinical care standard that said, this is the pathway of the expected level of care, but here are the indicators that go with it. And these are the indicators that clinicians might be interested in and be able to use in their process of re-accreditation. So trying to roll up the processes for allowing practitioners to work, so the regulation of those, they need to be re-credentialed or re-registered, and link that to the data that we collect and provide them with information about their own practice. So all of that then rolls up. We also have a program around clinical quality registers. So there is support and encouragement for participation in clinical quality registers. And that information then is available back to clinicians to understand how they practice, and then to be really to engage them then in the safety and quality elements of, well, how do we fix or how do we improve that practices? Some of the things are going to be systems level things that need to change, and therefore involve them through their interest in their own practice. So there's some strategies. Some of those might work in your situation. So carrot and stick always is really, you make sure that there's a process for requiring it, a process for supporting, for providing information about it and encouraging. But you know, at the end of the day, there's an accountability in that there's an expectation that there is involvement.
I think just to, if I'm allowed to slightly amplify on what Margaret said, or basically in sync with her, with my US experience, at the end of the day, the softer engagement of clinicians has always been extraordinarily challenging. And very interestingly, I thought that this was only a phenomenon in America, but even in India, you know, it is not very different. So that's the reason why, if you look at the United States in the last 10 years, the American Medical Association has migrated to what you just called the carrot and the stick policy. The carrot to the doctors were, hey, listen, guys, we have these quality parameters, and every year you have to report in this MACRA and the MIPS program for all the patients that you have seen for the last 12 months. If this database is not shared, you will start deducting from your Medicare payments X percentage effective from, that was implemented from 2017. So you'll get 1%, then 2%, then 4%, and all of that stuff. So I think the carrot and the stick policy truly works, but otherwise doctors are a very difficult breed. I myself, you know, including along with the other doctors, I can clearly identify, I think, you know, we are something God has very specially created us, and we are immune to a lot of things at the end of the day. And I think I personally feel there has to be a stick policy rather than, you know, a carrot to go by, for which we have to develop very comprehensive, you know, quality parameters. If they don't follow this, X will happen, Y will happen, and Z will happen. At least that should be the beginning, and we'll go to the carrots later on in our country. That's what I feel. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. And we have somebody who's saying, Dr. Jamuna Rani, in the comment, she says, that's a great idea, Dr. Reddy. So thank you very much, Margaret and Dr. Guru, for that wonderful session. Yes. I think, Margaret, you should go through the feedback. It's brilliant. Yes. You know, very crisp, precise, to the point. And to the Indian audience, you know, we are really struggling to set clinical governance with the kind of resistance in our own organizations. It's a developing country, so this is a developing concept. So the way you put it across, you know, I think all of us have understood exactly what is clinical governance. And to top it up, Dr. Guru, with his personal experience, has shared a lot of insights. And thank you very much, Dr. Guru, for your insights.
I appreciate it.
So dear participants, thank you all for joining this session. And we wish to thank Margaret for her time and the efforts. And I request Air Marshal Dr. Pawan Kapoor to present the virtual certificate with his feedback. Over to you, Pawan, sir.
Yeah. So Margaret, thank you very much for an excellent and a brilliant session. And you know, something which you highlighted, that clinical governance is a part of corporate governance. You also highlighted that clinical governance is not only patient-centric, but also supposed to be provider-centric. You know, so these important take-home messages They were brilliantly put across with a lot of good examples. On behalf of CAHO, please accept this certificate of appreciation for their brilliant presentation and their comprehensive talk. And, I think you have raised a lot of questions in the minds of a lot of us. And I'm sure together we'll sit together and probably find out ways and means to engage our clinicians with this clinical governance. So thank you very much, and please kindly accept this certificate of appreciation on behalf of CAHO.
Thank you kindly. And I will, been asked on a number of times to share the slides. I will send you a copy of the slides so that you can distribute them.
Having all of you next month with another interesting webinar. And thank you once again, Dr. Guru
Thank
and
you very much. Appreciate it.
Ms. Margaret Banks for joining us and for that wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.